In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus cautions us in the strongest of terms not to call anyone a fool. It's interesting. Jesus does not say that we cannot point out to people when they're doing foolish things. Jesus does not say that in the spirit of love we can't offer some correction. He tells us that we're not to call anyone a fool, and I think I probably understand the distinction. We can see when someone is doing foolish things. Anybody who's ever raised children knows exactly what I'm talking about. We can see when people are doing something dangerous. We can see when people are doing things that are not good for them, that are not healthy, either physically, emotionally, or spiritually. We can comment on those things because we can see them. But we cannot see a person's heart. And when you call a person a fool, you're not talking about what they're doing, you're talking about who they are. And we don't have the ability to see anyone's heart. We don't have the ability to know who they are. Only God has that ability. And when God says you are a fool, you are well and truly a fool, because God sees and God knows. Those are exactly the words God uses in this parable to describe the rich man. If you have a Bible that has headings or sort of outlines or things like that, you'll see that many people will refer to this parable as the parable of the rich fool. God knew the heart of the person used to illustrate this point. The parable of the rich fool warns of the dangers of greed. As I've been working, preparing this sermon series on parables used by Jesus to teach us moral truths, it's interesting to note parables that we do not find. We don't find a parable warning us against murder. We don't find a parable warning us against adultery. We don't find a parable warning us of the dangers of drunkenness. And I think I probably know why. Those sins are self-evident. We understand them. We know intuitively that those things are wrong. And if we have any familiarity at all with God's Word, we know that those things are sin. We know exactly what they are. They don't really need a whole lot more explanation. Jesus uses parables to warn us against more subtle ways to violate God's Word. If you remember, a parable comes from the same word as parallel. Two things that are laid side by side. Jesus uses an earthly story to illustrate a spiritual truth. Greed is a subtle and it is a deceptive sin. It's easy to slip into the sin of greed without realizing you even had done so. If I were going to go around the room, and I'm not going to, but if I was going to go around the room and ask each person to name a sin, not so much that you would commit, but just a sin, you'd like to be at the start of the line, because those would be pretty easy. As you got down to the end, people are going to have to be a little more thoughtful. But I think it's possible that every person in this room could name a sin without once mentioning greed. And yet, greed is important enough that Jesus uses this opportunity, this parable, to teach against it. Greed is the consuming desire to have more of something. A consuming desire to have more of something. Usually associated with money or valuable possessions. But it doesn't have to be. We can be greedy with our time. We can want more of our time for ourselves and less of our time for others. We can be greedy with our service. We can want to do things that benefit us, but don't benefit other people. Greed in the context of this parable, however, is used in the way I think that we most often consider greed. Having more stuff. Having more valuable stuff. Having in our society, in our economy, more money. In an agricultural economy, as was true in the first century, this wealthy farmer had more crops. He had had an abundance. His harvest had been plentiful. He had been blessed by God to be given more than he could ever use, and he had a problem. He didn't even know where to put it all. So he pondered this problem and came up with a solution. I'll just build bigger barns. Then I have more room to store more stuff so that I don't have to worry about me anymore. I can eat, I can drink. Some of the older translations will say, I can be merry. Eat, drink, and be merry. All about me. That's what greed really is. Greed is just selfishness at the most basic. I'm going to care about me. I'm not going to care about other people. And when God sees the solution he's found to his problem, God says, you fool. That very night, this man's soul was going to be required of him. I mean, he was going to die. He was going to die. And God was going to judge him. And all he could say to God is, I had a lot of stuff. You gave me a lot of blessings, and I just hoarded it all for myself. This parable begins, or the introduction to the parable really begins, with Jesus saying to the group, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. That's a real warning. That means not just don't do it intentionally. It means don't slip into it. I remember, I hate even to say this, more than 50 years ago, when I-75 was not completed fully, and parts of it were built, parts of it weren't, so you're bouncing back and forth between I-75 and the old road, old highway, US 41, and significant portions of I-75 were not completed north of Atlanta. And they had the most clever signs. Somebody put a lot of thought into this, and they'd been, professionally done. A painter knew what they were doing, but they were kind of homemade. And they were set up, I don't know, every mile or so, and the signs would say something like that. You gotta slow down. This isn't the interstate. And then you go a little further and they'd have a picture of like two cars hitting each other. And they said, we're not kidding. You gotta slow down. And then you go a little further and there'd be another sign that says, you're gonna die if you don't slow down. And these signs were warning signs that got our attention. Sometimes you might be walking on a path, a trail, you might be hiking, you might be in a mountain, you might be in the woods, you might be somewhere where there's some hazards that are there. It could be as simple as rocks that are loose and could give way and you could fall. It might be an area where there's snakes and you could step on one. It might be something like that. And when you're walking down those kind of paths, you pay a lot of attention. You want to know where your foot is going to step next. You want to be aware, and you want to be on your guard. Just like driving on an older road north of Atlanta 50 years ago, or just like walking through the swamp on a trail, you want to be hyper aware of danger that can be lurking there. That's the way we need to be when we guard against greed. You don't just assume it's not going to happen to you. You don't just say it's enough not consciously to think, well, I think I'll be greedy today. I think I'll just hold on to all my stuff and not use it for any good. No, it's more insidious. It's something that sneaks up on you. It's something that happens without even meaning to do it. We need to be aware of greed. We need to ask ourselves daily, am I being greedy? Am I being selfish? And I guess the opposite of being greedy would be generous. Am I being generous? And if the answer to that's no, you're probably being greedy. We need to examine ourselves and don't make the mistake of thinking that you have to be rich to be greedy. The person in this parable was, but you can be greedy if all you have is limited resources. You can be greedy if you're insistent upon hanging on to everything that God has given you and not using it to promote His work. The real problem is not wealth. Wealth is not the problem whether you have a lot of it or whether you have a little of it. The problem is our attitude toward wealth. Is wealth a tool that we're going to use to serve God? Or is it something we're going to hoard to ourselves so that we will have more, even if it means building bigger barns? I don't know if y'all find this interesting. I kind of do. I don't know when these self-storage units started, but I'm thinking, I don't know, back in the 70s, maybe, something like that. Never heard of one before, didn't know what one was. You had your stuff and you kept it at your house or you had it in your garage or whatever it was. But eventually, we needed to build more places to hold more stuff. And now, if you drive back and forth on 200s, which we do regularly, back and forth between home and here, it seems like every time you turn around, if they're not building a car wash, they're building a new self-storage place. People are building bigger barns. They may not be, you're renting a bigger barn to have more places to put your stuff. How we treat our possessions says a lot about how we feel about God. If you'll notice, in the flyleaf of the bulletin this morning, had a giving report for the month of May, and as usual, I had a Bible verse that I put in the bulletin on stewardship. And if you hadn't seen that, you don't hear this often. Take out your bulletins and open to the fly page. And let me read Matthew 6, 20-21. Jesus speaking says, "Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Do you want to know if you're greedy or not? I'll give you a quick test, and I would say take out your checkbook. I know some people don't even have checkbooks anymore, but take out your bank statement or whatever it is that shows you where you're spending your money. And go through line by line. What have you been spending your money for? People are spending some money for food and shelter, whether you have a mortgage payment or whether you have rent or whether you have property taxes, whatever you have. You're spending money wisely for those things. God does not expect that we would not use our money to sustain ourselves. But you ought to be finding places where you've been giving money to other people. where you've been giving money back to God through tithes and offerings. And if you have much, you should be giving much. And if you have little, you may be giving little, but you need to be giving something. I'm not going to do an audit. I'm not going to say, turn over your checkbook. I want to see it. That's none of my business. That's between you and God. But I really encourage you. I mean, I'm talking about literally doing it. Don't just think about it. Sit and look at whatever records you need to look at and see where your money is going, because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I want you to think about this, and I try not to be overly dramatic, and I don't want to try to scare people or things like that, but I want you really to think about this. I'm not kidding. If you die tonight, what is God going to say to you? Is he going to say, well done, thy good and faithful servant? Or is he going to say, you fool? I don't want God to think me a fool. And if I do not want God to see me as a fool, I don't need to act like one. Fools are greedy. Those people who love God are generous. We need to be spiritually rich. Some of us are more wealthy than others when it comes to things in this world. Money, things, stuff. Some of us less so. But all of us can be spiritually rich. We're not rich towards God when we store up for ourselves. Being rich towards God involves giving back to God. It's all His anyway. He entrusts it to our care. And when we do not give to God's work, we're being greedy, we're being stingy, and we're being foolish. Being rich towards God includes giving back to God, and it also includes being generous with others. What we give reveals how much treasure we're storing up in heaven. You've heard it said, as have I, you can't take it with you. That's true. I'm not the first person to say I've never seen a hearse towing a U-Haul. We can't take it with us, but you know what we can do? We can send it on ahead. And that's really what laying up treasure in heaven is all about. And I'm not talking about dollars or gold bars or diamonds. I'm talking about the things that money can do on earth to further God's kingdom. If we are wise, we will be laying up treasures in heaven, not trying to hold on to treasures here on earth. Don't build bigger barns. Look for better ways to use the resources that God has given you. Don't be a fool.